They laughed behind his back when he chose a bride who didn't meet their standards. They said this marriage wouldn't last and waited for him to realize his mistake. But 2 years later, they found themselves in shock. Write in the comments from where you're watching this video and subscribe to the channel. Andrew Carlisle had always been the kind of man people expected to marry perfection. Tall, with striking blue eyes and an effortless confidence, he had spent his entire adult life surrounded by privilege. His business acumen had turned him into a millionaire before 30, his name appearing on Forbes' lists of rising entrepreneurs. With his wealth, charm, and unshakable reputation, his social circle believed he could have anyone he wanted. Women from elite backgrounds, models, heiresses, rising actresses, had always been interested in him. He had dated some of them, entertained casual relationships, but never found anyone who truly captivated him beyond appearances. So when he announced his engagement to Samantha Evans, the world around him reacted with open disbelief. Samantha was everything Andrew's circle did not expect. She was black, full-figured, and came from a background far removed from the wealth and privilege that defined his life. Raised by a single mother in a modest neighborhood, she had worked tirelessly to carve a path for herself. Though she had not yet achieved the financial success Andrew had, she was respected in her field. As a certified nutritionist and wellness advocate, she ran a small business helping clients improve their health. She was intelligent, ambitious, and confident in a way that didn't rely on validation from others. But none of that seemed to matter to those who whispered behind Andrew's back. The reactions started subtly at first. Raised eyebrows, polite yet forced smiles whenever he brought Samantha to events. Then came the questions, delivered under the guise of concern. "Are you sure you two are a good match?" his colleagues would ask. "She seems different from the women you're usually with." His mother, Eleanor Carlisle, was less tactful. "Andrew, you need to think about the image you're presenting," she had told him over dinner one evening, her silverware clinking against her plate with an air of disapproval. "People expect a certain standard from you. Marriage isn't just about love, it's about compatibility, legacy." Andrew had dismissed her words, but he couldn't ignore the comments that spread among his peers. In private chat groups, they mocked him, making cruel jokes at Samantha's expense. Some said he had lost a bet. Others joked that he must be going through a phase or acting out against his family. Even those who weren't outright cruel expressed doubt. "It's just surprising," one of his business partners had said, a careful neutrality in his tone. "I mean, she's different from the kind of women you usually date." Samantha was aware of the judgment, even though Andrew tried to shield her from it. She could feel it in the way women in his circle barely acknowledged her at events, the way men spoke around her as if she weren't there. At a gala, one of Andrew's old university friends had walked up, glass of whiskey in hand, looked Samantha up and down, and smirked before turning to Andrew. "Damn, man, didn't expect this from you," he had said, voice full of amusement. The meaning was clear. Andrew's patience wore thin as he saw the way his so-called friends treated Samantha. He confronted some of them, cut ties with others, but it didn't change how people whispered when they weren't around. The online reaction was even worse. When news of their engagement hit social media, the flood of comments was relentless. "What does she have on him?" one post read. "There's no way this is real." Another thread on a popular forum speculated that she was using him for his wealth, with cruel jokes about how he would wake up and realize the mistake. The sheer volume of negativity was overwhelming, and while Samantha tried to pretend it didn't bother her, Andrew could see the way it chipped away at her spirit. The worst came from his own family. Eleanor refused to attend the engagement party, stating that she needed time to process things. His father, Richard Carlyle, was slightly more diplomatic, but still cold, shaking Samantha's hand with stiff formality. "You must understand," he had said to Andrew in private. "She's not what we envisioned for you. We just want what's best for your future." Despite all of this, Andrew never wavered. He had never cared about the expectations of others when it came to his personal life, and he wasn't about to start now. He loved Samantha, not because of how she looked or where she came from, but because of who she was. He admired her tenacity, the way she stood her ground even when the world pushed against her. He saw the way she made people around her feel seen and heard. In her, he had found something real, something that no shallow, picture-perfect relationship could ever give him. Samantha, however, struggled with the weight of it all. She had spent years building her confidence, overcoming the doubts society had placed on her, but nothing could have prepared her for the level of scrutiny she faced as Andrew's fiancée. Every time she walked into a room with him, she felt like an exhibit, something to be analyzed, criticized, and picked apart. She was used to judgment. She had faced it her entire life, but it was different when it came from people who believed they were superior, simply because of their wealth, status, and the color of their skin. At a high-profile dinner, one of the elite guests had leaned in close to her under the pretense of casual conversation and murmured, "It must be nice stepping into a life like this. Not many women from your background get the chance." The condescension was barely veiled, the message clear. You don't belong here. That night, as she lay in bed beside Andrew, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. "I don't know if I can do this," she finally whispered. Andrew turned toward her, concern etched across his face. "Do what?" She hesitated before answering. "Be part of this world. No matter what I do, they'll never see me as worthy of you." Andrew reached for her hand, his grip firm but reassuring. "Then we'll make them see, or we'll stop caring what they think." Easier said than done. The engagement period stretched on, and the judgment never ceased. Samantha tried to brush off the comments, to focus on the love she and Andrew shared rather than the hate thrown their way. But no matter how much she told herself it didn't matter, she couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly scrutinized, as though she were an outsider in her own life. The final straw came when a popular gossip column ran an article titled, "Andrew Carlisle's Shocking Choice, a Bride No One Expected." The piece was filled with backhanded compliments and thinly veiled insults, questioning whether Andrew had been pressured into the relationship or if Samantha was strategically securing a future for herself. It was humiliating. Andrew was furious, but Samantha felt something deeper than anger. A slow-burning resolve began to take shape inside her. She had spent her entire life proving people wrong. She had overcome countless obstacles, built a career from nothing, and refused to let society dictate her worth. Why should this be any different? That night, as Andrew held her close, she made a silent vow to herself. They thought she didn't belong. They thought she wasn't good enough. She would show them just how wrong they were. The weeks leading up to the wedding were nothing short of a battlefield. Samantha had known the world wouldn't celebrate their union, but she hadn't anticipated just how relentless the opposition would be. It wasn't just Andrew's family anymore. It was the media, the online trolls, the so-called friends who whispered behind their backs. It was in the way people treated her at dress fittings, in the way vendors subtly questioned if she was sure about her choices, as though she were a child playing pretend in a world where she didn't belong. The pressure mounted with each passing day, and though Andrew stood firmly beside her, it didn't make the weight any easier to bear. His mother, Eleanor Carlyle, had made her stance clear. She refused to attend, stating she needed time to process the engagement and the choices her son was making. Andrew had argued, fought, and pleaded, but she remained unmoved. His father, Richard, was more measured, yet his support was hollow. He had agreed to attend the ceremony, but his presence felt more like an obligation than a gesture of love. Andrew's extended family mirrored their sentiments, some opting out of the event entirely, others coming out of politeness rather than genuine joy. It was as if the wedding were a scandal, a stain on the Carlyle name that they all hoped to sweep under the rug. Samantha tried to brace herself, but the reality of the situation struck her hardest when she walked into her final wedding dress fitting. She had envisioned this moment countless times before, standing before a mirror, seeing herself as a bride, feeling a rush of excitement for the future. But the atmosphere in the boutique was cold, sterile. The consultant barely hid her skepticism when Samantha arrived, looking her up and down with a forced smile. The staff whispered, exchanging glances as they took her measurements. Samantha had grown used to judgment, but in that moment, standing on the fitting platform clad in silk and lace, she felt small. The dress was beautiful, a custom piece she had worked on for months, but all she could see in the mirror was the weight of expectations crushing down on her. The voices of those who doubted her echoed in her mind. She's not what he needs. He'll regret this. She doesn't belong in his world. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile when the consultant adjusted the gown. "You look different," the woman said, as if struggling to find a compliment. Samantha held her head high, pretending not to notice. But later that night, as she sat alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she did, no matter how beautiful the dress, no matter how deeply Andrew loved her, the world would never accept her as his equal. The wedding day arrived, a grand affair held at one of the most prestigious venues in the city. The venue itself was perfect, an elegant hall adorned with chandeliers and floral arrangements that seemed to stretch endlessly. Every detail had been meticulously planned, from the catering to the music to the delicate gold-trimmed invitations. Yet, despite the beauty of it all, there was an undeniable tension in the air. As Samantha stood at the entrance, gripping her bouquet, she took a deep breath. This was supposed to be her moment, the beginning of a new chapter, but instead, she felt like an intruder walking into a room filled with people waiting for her to fail. The guests were a mix of those who genuinely supported them and those who had simply come to watch the spectacle unfold. The murmurs started the moment she stepped forward. She saw it in their eyes. The judgment, the doubt, the quiet, unspoken belief that she didn't deserve to be here. Andrew, waiting at the altar, saw it too. His expression was firm, resolute, but there was a flicker of anger beneath the surface. He had always been aware of the resistance to their relationship, but seeing it so blatantly displayed on the most important day of their lives made his stomach twist. His so-called friends sat stiffly, their polite smiles failing to mask their disapproval. His business partners exchanged glances. Even some of the extended family members who had reluctantly agreed to attend made no effort to hide their skepticism. Samantha kept walking, each step heavier than the last. She refused to let them see her falter. The ceremony proceeded with formality. The vows exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers. The officiant declared them husband and wife, and Andrew kissed her, pouring every ounce of love he had into that moment. But, as they turned to face the crowd, the applause was hesitant, restrained. It wasn't the thunderous, joyous cheer that usually accompanied such a union. It was measured, obligatory, as if they were clapping out of politeness rather than celebration. At the reception, the tension lingered. Samantha could feel the careful distance people kept, the way conversations would hush when she approached. Even when people spoke to her, their words felt rehearsed, their smiles insincere. She had anticipated some coldness, but the sheer scale of it was suffocating. Andrew's father gave a speech, and while the words were diplomatic, there was a distinct lack of warmth. "Marriage is a journey," Richard Carlyle said, his tone composed, "and while every journey is unique, we can only hope that it leads to happiness." It was a statement crafted for neutrality, devoid of any real emotion. Eleanor's absence loomed over the evening like a shadow. The online reaction was just as brutal. Photos of the wedding surfaced within hours, and the comments flooded in. "He really went through with it. I give it 6 months. She must have something on him." The harshest remarks weren't even the most explicit ones. It was the ones wrapped in mockery, the ones that treated their love as a joke. Samantha scrolled through the post later that night, her heart sinking with each word. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but some part of her had hoped, naively perhaps, that people would at least acknowledge their love. Instead, they had turned her wedding day into another punchline. Andrew saw the pain in her eyes as she set her phone down. He reached for her, pulling her close. "Forget them," he said softly. "They don't matter." She wanted to believe him, but in the quiet of the night, when the music had faded and the last guests had left, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. This was supposed to be a day of joy, a celebration of their love. Instead, it had felt like a trial she had barely survived. For the first time since their engagement, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Not in loving Andrew, she would never doubt that, but in believing that love alone would be enough to silence the world. She had thought that the worst of the judgment would fade after the wedding, that people would move on. But as she lay there, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, she realized something chilling. This was only the beginning. The morning after the wedding, Samantha woke up with an unfamiliar weight in her chest. It wasn't the exhaustion of a long celebration, nor the bliss that was supposed to accompany the start of a new life. It was something colder, heavier. She lay still, listening to Andrew's slow, steady breathing beside her, trying to process everything. The echoes of last night still rang in her ears, the murmurs, the polite but insincere smiles, the whispers behind her back, the scrutinizing looks that made her feel like an exhibit rather than a bride. Even in the moments where she had forced herself to laugh and dance, the sensation of being watched, judged, measured had clung to her skin like an invisible film she couldn't scrub away. She turned onto her side, watching Andrew's face in the soft morning light. He had fought for her, defended her, stood by her despite the disapproval of nearly everyone in his world. He had chosen her, and she loved him for it. But love didn't change the way the world saw her. Love didn't erase the sneers, the smirks, the way people still whispered that she didn't belong. Andrew stirred, his eyes fluttering open, immediately finding her gaze. He smiled, reaching for her hand, but she couldn't return the gesture with the same ease. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. She hesitated before nodding. "I'm fine." He studied her for a long moment, not believing her, but choosing not to push. He knew the weight she carried even if he couldn't fully understand it. The honeymoon was meant to be an escape, a chance to step away from the noise and just be together. Andrew had chosen a secluded resort, away from cameras and prying eyes. For a little while it worked. They laughed, they explored, they stole kisses under the sun. But the world had a way of creeping back in. On their second night, as they sat in a quiet restaurant overlooking the water, Samantha caught snippets of a conversation at a nearby table. She wasn't trying to listen, but the words carried over easily. "I still can't believe he married her. She must have something on him. There's no other explanation. She looks ridiculous next to him. He could have had anyone." The voices were hushed but sharp, laced with that particular brand of cruelty that thrived in private conversations between people who believed they would never be overheard. Samantha's grip on her wineglass tightened. Her appetite vanished. Andrew noticed the shift in her posture immediately. "Sam?" She forced herself to look at him, forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "It's nothing." He followed her gaze to the table of strangers, his jaw tightening. For a moment, she thought he might confront them, but she placed a hand on his wrist. "Don't," she said softly. "It won't change anything." The rest of the dinner was tense, heavy with unspoken words. That night, as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their suite, she realized something she had been trying to ignore. No matter how much she loved Andrew, no matter how fiercely he loved her, she would always be seen as the woman who wasn't supposed to be by his side. She would always be the one people looked at and whispered about, the one they picked apart with their judgments and assumptions. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, had she made a mistake? When they returned home, the doubts didn't fade. The murmurs hadn't lessened in their absence. The media still dissected their wedding photos, still speculated on how long their marriage would last. Eleanor Carlisle had yet to acknowledge Samantha as her daughter-in-law, and Richard's approval remained distant, a formality rather than a true acceptance. Samantha's work as a nutritionist had always been a source of pride for her, a testament to how she had built something for herself from nothing. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that people saw her success as a fluke, or worse, as something she had only gained because of Andrew. Her confidence, something she had worked so hard to cultivate, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. One evening, after a long, exhausting day, she sat alone in their living room scrolling mindlessly through her phone. A video clip appeared in her feed, an interview featuring one of Andrew's former acquaintances, a man who had once been part of his inner circle. "I just don't see it lasting," he said with an easy smirk. "I mean, come on, we all know this isn't real. She's riding the wave, enjoying the perks, but Andrew's going to wake up one day and realize what a mistake he made." Samantha stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It wasn't just the words. It was the certainty in his voice, the way he spoke as if her worth was non-existent, as if her marriage was nothing more than a cruel joke waiting to unravel. Her phone vibrated in her hand. A message from an old friend popped up. "You okay? Saw that interview. You don't have to prove anything to these people." But didn't she? She set the phone down, inhaling deeply. For so long, she had told herself that none of this mattered, that love was enough. But love wasn't what would silence them. Love wasn't what would make them choke on their words. She had spent her entire life proving people wrong. This would be no different. The next morning, Samantha woke with a renewed sense of determination. She didn't tell Andrew everything that had been weighing on her, not yet, but she told him the part that mattered. "I want to make some changes," she said as they sat at the breakfast table. "For myself." He frowned, setting down his coffee. "What kind of changes?" She hesitated, then met his gaze with steady resolve. "I want to take control of my life again. I want to push myself, to be stronger, to prove to myself that I don't have to shrink under their judgment." Andrew studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Whatever you need, I'm with you." It started small, adjusting her diet, fine-tuning her exercise routine. She'd always been mindful of health, but now it became something more, a mission. She threw herself into her work, pouring energy into new certifications, expanding her knowledge, setting higher goals. The progress was slow at first. There were days when she felt like giving up, when the voices in her head echoed the ones she had heard at that restaurant, telling her she wasn't enough, that she never would be. But she refused to break. Months passed, and the changes became undeniable. Not just physically, though that was part of it. The weight loss, the muscle tone, the newfound strength. It was the confidence that returned to her step, the way she carried herself differently, the way she no longer flinched when people looked at her. Andrew noticed. So did everyone else. At a business event 6 months after the wedding, Samantha walked into the room with her head held high, wearing a sleek black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. The same men who had dismissed her before now watched her with something else in their eyes. Not quite admiration, but not mockery either. The same women who had whispered behind her back now regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She wasn't the woman they had expected. She had never been, and now she was about to show them exactly who she was. Samantha had always been determined, but this was different. This wasn't just about health or fitness or proving a point. This was about reclaiming herself from the grip of a world that had spent too long trying to define her worth for her. Every morning, she woke before the sun, laced up her running shoes, and pushed herself harder than she ever had before. At first, it was grueling. Her body ached, her muscles protested, and doubt whispered in the back of her mind, telling her she was chasing something impossible. But she silenced it, one step at a time, one workout at a time, one small victory at a time. Andrew watched her transformation with a mixture of awe and admiration. He had always seen the strength in her, but now the world was starting to see it too. Their home became a place of relentless focus, of late-night study sessions as Samantha immersed herself in nutrition research, of carefully planned meals, of sweat and exhaustion, and quiet triumphs. She wasn't just changing physically. She was sharpening her mind, refining her expertise, taking every lesson she had learned and turning it into something greater. Then came the moment when everything shifted. One morning, as she scrolled through her inbox, she saw an email from a journalist she had never met. The subject line made her heart skip a beat. "Your story is inspiring. Can we talk?" The journalist, a well-known health and wellness writer, had come across one of Samantha's blog posts detailing her journey. Not just the physical transformation, but the mental and emotional battle that came with it. The piece had resonated with people. It had been shared hundreds of times, commented on by women who had felt the same struggles, who had been told they weren't enough. They weren't just interested in her expertise. They were interested in her. She read the email 3 times before showing it to Andrew. He grinned. "I told you people would see what I see." The interview was scheduled for the following week, and Samantha spent days preparing. She wanted to articulate her journey in a way that mattered, not as a woman who had changed herself to fit expectations, but as someone who had learned to stop seeking permission to exist in spaces she had every right to occupy. When the day arrived, she sat across from the journalist in a quiet cafe, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and told her story. She talked about the doubts, the whispered judgments, the weight of being constantly scrutinized. She talked about the moment when she realized she was done shrinking herself to make others comfortable. She talked about how health wasn't about being thin or fitting into a certain image. It was about strength, about confidence, about choosing yourself over the voices that tried to diminish you. The article went live a week later, and the response was overwhelming. Messages flooded her inbox. Women from all walks of life, some who had struggled with body image, some who had been told they weren't good enough, some who had simply needed to hear the words she had spoken, reached out to thank her. And then the offers started coming in. First, it was a small fitness podcast inviting her to speak. Then, a brand reached out, wanted to collaborate on a campaign about self-confidence and well-being. A local gym asked her to lead a seminar on nutrition and mindset. Slowly, the tide was shifting. The same people who had dismissed her were starting to take notice. But not everyone was happy about it. Andrew's business acquaintances, the same men who had once smirked and whispered, now spoke with feigned interest. "Samantha's getting quite a bit of attention," one of them remarked at a dinner party. The tone was neutral, but Andrew recognized the undercurrent. They weren't impressed, they were wary. And then there were the women. The ones who had turned their noses up at her at events, who had barely acknowledged her presence, who had whispered behind manicured hands. Now their smiles were a little too bright. Their compliments felt forced. "You look amazing," one of them said at a charity gala, her eyes scanning Samantha with something that wasn't quite admiration. "I barely recognized you." Samantha didn't let it rattle her. She had spent too much time letting other people dictate how she felt about herself. Now she carried herself differently. She stood taller. She didn't apologize for taking up space. The real test came when an old acquaintance reached out, someone she hadn't spoken to in years who had once belittled her behind her back. "We should catch up," the message read. "I'd love to hear about everything you're working on." Samantha stared at the screen for a long moment before closing the message without responding. She had nothing to prove to them. Andrew noticed the change in her, too. One evening, as they sat on their balcony overlooking the city, he reached for her hand. "You're different," he said. She turned to him, arching a brow. "Different how?" He smiled, squeezing her fingers. "You don't second-guess yourself anymore." She exhaled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I don't have time for that anymore." The months that followed were a whirlwind. Samantha's presence in the wellness space continued to grow. Her Instagram following surged. A well-respected fitness magazine reached out for an interview. She started working on an online program to help women like her, women who had been made to feel like they weren't enough, who had been overlooked, underestimated. And then the invitation came. An email from one of the biggest health and wellness conferences in the country. "We would love to have you as a guest speaker." Samantha read it twice, her pulse pounding. This was it. This was the moment when the world, the same world that had laughed at her, that had dismissed her, that had doubted her, was now asking to hear what she had to say. She showed the email to Andrew, and he grinned. "They're finally catching up." She smiled, but deep down, she knew the truth. They weren't catching up. They were realizing what they had overlooked all along, and she was just getting started. The weeks leading up to the wellness conference were a blur of preparation. Samantha had spent years in the world of health and nutrition, but standing on a stage in front of industry leaders, influencers, and the very people who once dismissed her was an entirely new challenge. It was one thing to share her journey in interviews or on social media. It was another to be recognized as an authority, to be invited to speak not as a novelty, but as an expert. She spent hours crafting her speech, refining each word to ensure that it wasn't just about her transformation, but about the lessons she had learned along the way. She wanted to speak to the people who had felt invisible, who had been told they weren't enough, who had spent their lives being underestimated. Andrew watched her with quiet pride as she rehearsed in their living room, pacing back and forth, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. He had always known she was remarkable, but now the world was beginning to see it too. There were still whispers, of course. Still the occasional doubters, the skeptics who couldn't reconcile the woman standing before them with the image they had held in their minds. But Samantha didn't care about them anymore. She had wasted enough time worrying about the opinions of people who had no stake in her life. Now she was focused on the ones who did. When they arrived at the conference, the energy was electric. Samantha could feel the eyes on her as she walked through the venue, but this time they weren't filled with derision. There was curiosity, recognition. A few people even stopped her to say they had followed her journey, that they admired what she was doing. For the first time in a long time, she felt something close to belonging. But not everyone was pleased to see her rise. She noticed the familiar faces in the crowd, women who had once sneered at her, men who had dismissed her, the same elite socialites who had treated her as an outsider at Andrew's business events. Now they watched her with thinly veiled surprise, their polite smiles unable to hide the discomfort beneath them. It was the look of people realizing they had underestimated someone. Her name was called, and she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the room silent. A sea of expectant faces looked up at her, waiting. She took a breath, steadying herself. And then she spoke. She spoke about the way society tried to define people, how they measured worth by standards that had nothing to do with a person's value. She spoke about the struggle of being told she wasn't good enough, about the whispers behind her back, the judgment in people's eyes. But most importantly, she spoke about overcoming it, about choosing to define herself instead of letting the world do it for her. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. She stepped off the stage feeling lighter than she had in years. She had done it. She had stood in front of an audience that once doubted her and proved, without anger, without bitterness, that she was more than they had ever given her credit for. Andrew was waiting for her, his smile wide, his pride evident. "You were incredible," he said, wrapping his arms around her, and for the first time in a long time she believed it. But success came with a price. The moment her speech was uploaded online, it spread rapidly. People shared it, commented on it, debated it. Most of the feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but there were also those who refused to accept her rise. The whispers returned, this time with a different edge. "She's trying too hard. She's just riding the wave of social media attention. She wouldn't be where she is without Andrew." And then there were the women, the ones who had always looked down on her. Now they watched her with thinly veiled irritation. Some of them tried to befriend her, as if rewriting history, pretending they had never doubted her. Others clung to their disdain, refusing to acknowledge her growth. At a gala a few weeks later, one of them approached her with a saccharine smile. "You've really changed," she said, her tone just a little too sweet. "I mean, it's inspiring, really. You must feel so lucky." Samantha met her gaze evenly. "I don't believe in luck," she said, "just hard work." The woman's smile faltered. And then there were Andrew's business acquaintances, the same men who had smirked at him, who had joked about his questionable choice in a wife, now spoke to him with carefully measured words. They asked about Samantha's work as if they had always been supportive, pretending they hadn't once mocked her behind his back. One evening, at a particularly high-profile networking event, one of them pulled Andrew aside. "You must be proud," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She's really made something of herself." Andrew's smile was slow, sharp. "She always was something." The man blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Samantha saw it all happening, the slow shift in how people treated her, the way some tried to align themselves with her success while others refused to acknowledge it. But none of it mattered, because for the first time in her life, she didn't need their approval. She had built something for herself. She had proven to herself, more than anyone, that she was capable, that she was worthy, that she didn't need validation from people who had never believed in her to begin with. And as she stood beside Andrew, watching the same people who had once laughed at her now vying for her attention, she realized something. She had already won. Samantha had spent years proving people wrong, but she had never done it for them. She had never been interested in revenge and rubbing her success in the faces of those who doubted her. She had built herself up for herself, not to satisfy some silent competition. But it was impossible not to notice the shift in the way people treated her now. The ones who had laughed at her behind her back now watched her with quiet unease. The ones who had dismissed her were now trying to associate with her. And the ones who had outright insulted her were the ones who seemed to struggle the most. The change became most obvious at an industry event where Andrew was one of the keynote speakers. Samantha had come with him, as she often did now, but for the first time, she was not just his wife, she was a name in her own right. People approached her as much as they did him. Some asked for advice, others complimented her work, and a few even tried to act as though they had been supportive of her all along. Among the crowd was a man she recognized instantly. He had been one of the loudest voices against her when she and Andrew got married. A former business acquaintance of Andrew's, he had made jokes at her expense, doubted their marriage's longevity, and at one point had outright told Andrew that he was throwing his life away by being with her. Now he was standing in front of her, holding a drink, a nervous smile on his face. "Samantha," he said, his voice overly warm, as if they were old friends. "It's been a while." She met his gaze, calm and unreadable. "It has. I have to say, I've been following what you've been doing. Really impressive stuff. You've come so far." She simply nodded, waiting. He cleared his throat. "Actually, I was wondering if you'd be open to a collaboration. I've got a few ideas I think would really align with what you're doing in the wellness space." The irony was not lost on her. This man, who had once openly ridiculed her, was now asking for her help. She could hear the desperation in his voice, see the way he was trying to position himself close to her now that she had something he wanted. She took a slow sip of her drink before responding. "I appreciate the interest, she said, voice smooth, "but I'm very particular about who I work with." His smile faltered just slightly. He nodded, quickly masking his discomfort with another sip of his own drink. Of course. Of course. Just thought I'd ask." She left it at that, watching as he shifted uncomfortably before excusing himself. It wasn't just him. Over the next few weeks, more and more people who had once dismissed her tried to find ways to reconnect. Old acquaintances, former classmates, even some of Andrew's business partners who had once doubted their marriage were suddenly interested in what she was doing. They spoke as if they had always been supporters, as if their past words had never been spoken. But Samantha hadn't forgotten. At a dinner event, another familiar face approached her. A woman who had been particularly cruel to her when she first stepped into Andrew's world. She had made snide comments, laughed at her behind her back, and once even told Andrew that he could do better. Now, she was all smiles, dressed in designer, her eyes scanning Samantha with something that wasn't quite admiration but wasn't disdain either. "You look incredible," she said, her voice honeyed but forced. "Honestly, I hardly recognized you." Samantha tilted her head slightly, offering a polite smile. "I get that a lot." The woman's smile twitched, but she pressed on. "We should catch up. I feel like we got off on the wrong foot before." There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of the past, just an assumption that time had erased everything. Samantha took a breath, considering, then she smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't think that's necessary." The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, well, if you ever change your mind, I won't." The conversation ended there. Andrew noticed these interactions. He had always known what Samantha went through, had always seen the way people treated her. But now he was watching as those same people scrambled to rewrite history. One evening, as they left another event, he turned to her, his expression somewhere between amusement and pride. "They're all regretting how they treated you," he said. Samantha exhaled, glancing back at the glittering venue behind them. "They are." He smiled. "Does it feel good?" She thought about it for a moment. It should have. But instead of satisfaction, she just felt a quiet sense of finality. "I don't need them to regret it," she said finally. "I just need them to know that I never needed their approval to begin with." And that was the truth of it. She had won. Not by proving them wrong, not by making them regret their words, but by realizing she had never needed their validation in the first place. And that was a victory they would never understand. Samantha had always thought that success would feel different. She had imagined a moment of finality, a sense of undeniable victory, the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing she had proven everyone wrong. But as she sat in her office, reviewing the latest updates on her business, she realized something that should have been obvious all along. The moment wasn't coming. There was no grand scene where the people who doubted her would suddenly admit they had been wrong. No perfect confrontation where she could say, "I told you so," and watch them squirm. Instead, they were simply fading into the background, their voices quieter, their opinions less relevant with each passing day. Her wellness brand was thriving. The conference had opened new doors, leading to more speaking engagements, collaborations, and interviews. What had once been a small project had become a full-fledged company with a growing team and a dedicated audience. Women from all walks of life reached out to share their own stories, thanking her for inspiring them to take control of their health and confidence. It was more than she had ever envisioned when she first started, and yet it still felt like she was just getting started. Andrew had noticed the shift in her. He saw it in the way she carried herself, the way she no longer hesitated before walking into a room, the way she didn't flinch at whispers or feel the need to prove her place at every table. She was no longer fighting for validation. She simply existed in her own space, fully and unapologetically. One evening, as they sat together on their balcony, he turned to her, studying her expression. "You're different," he said, his voice thoughtful. She smiled slightly, glancing at him. "Good different or bad different?" He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Stronger different, like you don't need anyone's permission anymore." She exhaled, watching the city lights stretch out before them. "I don't think I ever did. I just thought I did." Andrew nodded. He had always known this. He had seen her worth long before the world had caught up. The next morning, as Samantha prepared for another meeting, she received a message that made her pause. It was from Eleanor Carlisle, Andrew's mother. "Would love to have dinner soon. Let me know when you're available." Samantha stared at the screen, rereading the words. It had been nearly 2 years since the wedding, and Eleanor had never made an effort to reach out before. She had barely acknowledged her existence, always keeping a polite but noticeable distance. And now, suddenly, she wanted dinner. She showed the message to Andrew, who sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's realizing she misjudged you," he said, "or at least realizing she can't ignore you anymore." Samantha wasn't sure how she felt about it. Part of her wanted to ignore the message, to leave it unanswered the way Eleanor had left her out of their lives for so long. But another part of her, perhaps the part that had spent too many years fighting to be seen, wanted to hear what she had to say. A few nights later, she found herself sitting across from Eleanor at an upscale restaurant, the candlelight flickering between them. Eleanor looked as poised as ever, her jewelry understated but expensive, her posture perfectly composed. But there was something different in her expression, something that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't pride either. "I owe you an explanation," Eleanor said, folding her hands neatly on the table. Samantha waited, not rushing her. "I won't pretend I was fair to you," Eleanor continued, her voice measured. "When you and Andrew got together, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand you. I made assumptions, and I let my own biases dictate how I saw you, and that was a mistake." Samantha tilted her head slightly. "What changed?" Eleanor exhaled, glancing down briefly before meeting her gaze again. "You did." The words hung between them for a moment, heavier than they seemed. "I thought you were just another phase in Andrew's life," Eleanor admitted. "Someone who wouldn't last. I thought you were chasing status, that you didn't belong in our world. And I was wrong." Samantha studied her carefully. There was no dramatic apology, no pleading for forgiveness. Just a simple admission of what had been true all along. "I don't need your approval, Eleanor," she said after a moment. "I never did." Eleanor nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "I know." And for the first time, Samantha believed her. When she returned home that night, Andrew was waiting for her, his curiosity evident. "How was it?" he asked. She set her purse down, exhaling. Surprisingly honest. He raised a brow. "And?" She shrugged. "It doesn't change anything, but I think she finally sees me." Andrew wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "She should have seen you all along." The next few weeks passed quickly, filled with new projects, new opportunities, and a sense of stability that Samantha had never thought possible. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but they didn't consume her anymore. She had spent too long waiting for validation that was never going to come in the way she once wanted it to. And now, standing on the other side of it all, she realized she didn't need it. One afternoon, she received an email from an old colleague, someone who had once doubted her, who had dismissed her success as temporary. They were struggling, looking for guidance, hoping for a connection. She read the email twice, then closed it without responding. She didn't owe them anything. That evening, as she and Andrew walked through their neighborhood, hand in hand, she felt something settle in her chest, something steady, something final. For so long, she had thought she needed to prove herself to the world, that she needed to change their minds, to make them see her worth. But the truth was, she had never needed them at all. And that was the greatest realization of all. Samantha had never been one for grand finales. Life didn't work that way. There was no single moment where everything suddenly made sense. No dramatic conclusion where every loose end was tied up neatly. But as she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, looking out at the city skyline, she felt something close to closure. It wasn't the kind of closure that came from others admitting they had been wrong. It wasn't the kind that came from revenge or validation. It was simply the quiet realization that she had outgrown the need for either. Her success was no longer a response to doubt. It wasn't a reaction to the people who had laughed at her, belittled her, dismissed her. It wasn't a rebuttal to the whispered conversations or the assumptions made about her. It was hers, completely and entirely. It belonged to her because she had built it, because she had chosen it, because she had worked for it, not to prove anything to anyone, but because it was what she wanted for herself. Andrew entered the room, his presence as steady as ever. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. "You're thinking about something," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Always?" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "What is it this time?" She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I think I'm finally done." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to explain. "For so long, I felt like I was still fighting something, still proving something. But I don't feel that way anymore," she said. "I don't need to win anything, I already have." He studied her for a moment, then smiled. "I could have told you that a long time ago." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, I had to figure it out myself." Later that night, as they prepared for an event, one of the many now that they attended not out of obligation but because they genuinely wanted to, Samantha received a message that made her pause. It was from someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Someone from her past, before Andrew, before any of this. It was a former classmate, someone who had once been dismissive, cruel even. Someone who had laughed at her, mocked her, made her feel small. The message was brief. "I see you everywhere now. I was wrong about you. I'm sorry." She stared at it for a long moment, then set her phone down without responding. She didn't need the apology. It didn't change anything. The past was the past. At the event that night, she saw the familiar faces, the people who had once doubted her, who had once whispered about her behind her back. Some still struggled to accept her presence, clinging to their outdated views. Others had changed their tune, now eager to be associated with her success. But none of it mattered. She moved through the room with an ease she hadn't known before, not because she had won them over, but because she no longer cared if she did. She didn't need their approval. She never had. At one point, she caught a glimpse of Eleanor Carlyle across the room. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time there was something like respect there. Not affection, not warmth, but respect. It was enough. By the end of the night, Samantha and Andrew walked out of the event together, hand in hand, stepping into the quiet of the evening. The city stretched out before them, alive and endless. Samantha took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. She had spent so much of her life thinking she needed to fight to be seen. But she saw herself now, and that was all that had ever really mattered. As they walked away, she felt the weight of the past finally lift. She was free. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you'd never miss our latest videos. Check out more of our stories for even more inspiring transformations and unexpected journeys. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. You never know who might need to hear this today.